Well, here we are once again, ladies and gentlemen. Show slates. There we are, show slates number 4. Very well. Now, show slates number 4 comes really to the essence of the matter. What I have dealt with before is well, a general introduction, and then I went on and I tried to give you a background to, well, the 1860s, but really I was trying to give you a background to the world in which Tully arrived, and the history then that followed. Now, as I say, Charleville has had a sort of a history, and if you go to the internet, well, I'll move this chair in a bit. Again, I might add, I have no technical assistant, but nevertheless, we'll move on from there. If you go to the internet, well, God, every man and his dog will give you the history of Charleville, and, you know, it's an old case of, you know, a lie or a mistake repeated often enough becomes a truth. And so if you go to so many of the histories of Charleville, or that are purported to be the histories of Charleville, well, there's an oft-repeated untruth there. So let's not worry about that. Let's just say that a lot of them have got a lot of mistakes in them. And every time I see the word Tully in 1868 and all of that sort of thing, I shudder. Anyway, but no one else has shuddered for a long time, but we can get rid of the shuddering now. And so what I was going to do is to do two things. First of all, I'm going to give you a very brief, point-by-point history of what happened in those early years, point-by-point, as an initial summary. That tend, or attempt anyway, to give the lie to a lot of the stuff that was printed, or probably from the 1830s, and particularly from Alan Morrison's work in 1845, 1846, and even Claire Wagner repeated some of it in her work. I think she did that in, 1991 or thereabouts, but still. Now look, this should give the lie to that. I'll go through and I'll outline the principal things that happened in those early years, and then I'll return and take it point by point. Now, I probably can't give the full story of each of these points in this one video because each of them has got a story in itself. But nevertheless, that's what I'll do. Now, here we are. I'll go through them point by point. What I say here is what you can find in the records, and you can look them up for yourself if you like. Now, first of all, we begin. 1864. The town was surveyed by, or the town reserve rather, was surveyed by Tully in winter or in early spring. In 1864, the name Charleville became, or appeared first of all, in a public notice in relation to the forthcoming elections, because this was a new electoral district and they had to begin advertising for the elections that were to take place, I think, in the following March. And so the name first appeared in public in a Gazette notice on the 11th of October of 1864. So in 1865, on the 11th of January, in the Government Gazette, the town reserve was gazetted, and the outline, the dimensions and so on of that reserve were published also in the Gazette on that day. The next big event was in 1866, and it says that residents at the settlement that had developed at the upper crossing petitioned the government for a survey of town allotments so that if they had effected improvements at that point, they could actually purchase the surveyed property, and that occurred on the 5th of September 1866. In 1866, later in the year, Chester, H.M. Chester, was sent to Charleville, or went to Charleville, or was in Charleville, and he surveyed sufficient allotments within the town reserve to meet the needs of those who were resident there at the time. Now, what he was trying to do was to meet the needs of those who had effected improvements. And so he surveyed the town. I think he began with sections 1, 2 and 3. He may have even gone into a section 4, I can't recall. But the principal sections were sections 1 and 2. These were in Alfred Street between Will Street and Burke Street, with Eyre Street intruding down in the middle there somewhere. But that was in late 1866. Now, Chester then produced his survey plan of Charleville. Its number is C1401, and he dated that the 7th of February 1867. Now, that was the first real map of Charleville town. And its intention then was to give a surveyed town which had allotments available for purchase. And that auction that allowed that purchase took place in or on the 30th of September 1867. So that by 1867 the town reserve had been surveyed, the township had been declared, the surveyor Chester had surveyed the basic blocks of the town, and so by 1867, with that land survey or that land auction, the town was a going concern. So that's the guts of the basic history. 1868, you'll notice I didn't even mention, and Tully I mentioned back in 1864 visiting the town to survey the town reserve, and that's it. There are a few other bits and pieces along here that then get their way into the Charleville history. Let me see. Well, of course, the first thing is that the town shouldn't have been there. Gregory, the Surveyor General, had intended that the town be at Mangalore, but then all sorts of interesting things went on between 1864 and about the end of about 1869, perhaps even into 1870, you may say. All sorts of things went on, a struggle between those who wanted the town to remain at the upper crossing in Charleville, or those who thought, look, we really should move it to the flood-free area down the road to Mangalore. Okay then, now what else happens? Oh, yes. Every now and then people say that Tully, and they refer to Tully and Charleville as Tully's boyhood home and so on, or his native town, or things like that. Tully was actually born in Dublin. Then sometimes they say that Charleville was named after his mother's birthplace, I think. But she was born in Wilton Castle in Wexford. Then we read that Galatea Street was named, named after the ship that brought him to Australia. It was named after the ship that brought him to Queensland, all that sort of thing, but that's not so. In late 1867, 1868, the Duke of Edinburgh, brother to the Prince of Wales of the time, and who later became the King, was in command of a ship called the Galatea, and so amid all of the patriotic fervour of his visit to Australia and to Brisbane, the street Galatea was named after the ship that was, I suppose theoretically, commanded by Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh. Okay then. Then on we go. The streets then, of course, you've got Will Street, Alfred Street, of course, was named after the Duke of Edinburgh. Then we've also got the Will Street, Eyre Street, Burke Street, named after explorers because they were great historical favourites of that particular period. And then, let me see, Watson Street, I really don't know what the derivation of Watson Street was. And then, let me see, we've got the next thing here. Oh yeah, sometimes in history you'll read, and this comes from essentially from the Janetzky memoirs, that they say, well, you take your pick. Sometimes they say that Mary, that's the daughter, Janetzky, was the first white child born, but that's not so. Sometimes they say Louisa, who was actually the second of the Janetzky children, was the first white child born in Charleville. Well, that's also not true. The first white child born in Charleville could have been a child born down in Mangalore. That would have been that was in October 1865. But if we wanted to restrict it actually to what was called Charleville itself, there was a child called Alice Mary Cora Allwood, born on the 31st of December 1865. And actually that particular record is in the Charleville Centenary booklet, the first 10 births or whatever. And despite the fact that that was in the Centenary booklet printed in 1847, people kept on saying, still even after that date, that Louisa Janetzky was the first white child born in Charleville. There was also the claim that Mary Janetzky, that's the mother, was the first white woman in Charleville, but she didn't arrive until April 1866. And one has to assume that Alice Allwood, who was born in December 1865, had a mother, if she was born in Charleville, and so, that gives the lie to that one. And so on. That's actually the guts of the story, but it's the distortions of that story that you'll see most often in the potted histories that appear on on the internet. And it's a pity. 1868, over and over and over again. So let me explain some of that. The reason for all of those errors comes from the fact that, as I say, the Janetzky reminiscences were taken to be the history of Charleville. Well, the Janetskys didn't intend writing a history of Charleville, and when they did write their story, you have to remember that the granddaughters of Mary Janetzky were claiming to record the memories of their mother, who died in 1912, who was remembering the stories of Mary when the 1860s came. And so the Janetzky stories tend to be recollections of recollections. One of the ladies who claimed to base her articles in the newspapers on stories that her grandmother had told her was only 4 when her grandmother died. So she was a girl of, prodigious memory and prodigious retention. But of course, the Janetskys got things a little bit mixed up. For instance, in one of the Janetzky stories, they said that Tully came there in 1868. He went out and he surveyed the town and named the streets, I might add. And then and of course he also stayed at the Janetzky Hotel. And when he had finished all of this, he went out into the streets and he spilt a certain amount of rum in celebration of his great 1868 surveying work. Well, I closed this book. I don't really need to open it anymore. He went out and was celebrating his great surveying work of 1868, with everything surveyed, streets named and all that sort of thing. And he named it, or renamed it, Charleville. Well, let's see. Now, we know he went there in 1864. What we also know is that Chester, the surveyor, was there in late 1866. Now, Chester did the surveying of the town blocks, and he wouldn't have done the name of the town streets. I take it the town streets were sort of allocated by an official in Brisbane at some stage and added later on to Chester's survey plan. And the Janetskys got mixed up. Who would have written that? It may be they were the Granddaughters, or maybe it was Louisa. I'm not sure, but it sounds more like the Granddaughters, really. And they knew that somehow or another a surveyor had been in town, and indeed he had stayed at the salubrious, what in those days would have been Cooper's Hotel, which was run by the Janetskys. So at least they knew a surveyor was in town, had done some surveying work with streets, but somehow or another they thought it was in 1868. Well, okay then. Tully was there in 1864. He could not have stayed at the Janetzky Hotel, although when he was there in 1864, let me see, there would have been what was described by Churton as the caravanserai. He may have stayed there in 1864, and then away he went, because of course he was anxious to get back to Brisbane. If any surveyor stayed at the Janetzky Hotel, it would have been in late 1866. It was still by that time that Janetzky's had taken over, but it was still called the Cooper's Hotel, and it might have been Chester who stayed at the hotel in 1866, but not 1868, nor 1864. We know that Chester surveyed the town blocks. Whether he actually named the streets, I don't know, but I doubt that was so, because I don't think that the real fervour of street naming in association with the visit of Duke of Edinburgh probably caught on in Queensland until early 1868, and it may have been that the street names were given then, but I doubt very much whether they were given by Chester. So, yes, a surveyor did stay at the Janetzky Hotel, not in 1868, but in fact the surveyor was Chester, who could have stayed there in late 1866, so that was it. Now, of course, the town by that time, excuse me, the town, excuse me, I'm getting old. Excuse me, by that time, of course, Tully had been and gone. Now, Tully came out there in 1864. I don't know that he particularly wanted to go there, because Tully was accustomed to a pretty comfortable life. He had been educated at Trinity College in Dublin. His mother was born in Wilton Castle in Wexford. And for him to come from that background and be a graduate of Trinity College in Dublin, he had a pretty comfortable life, I can tell you. And he must have had pretty good connections, because he moved then directly after he graduated, where I suspect his major concern was religion, because Trinity College was also the training ground for ministers of the Church of Ireland, and Trinity College was a bastion of what they call the Protestant ascendancy of Ireland at that time, and Catholics and other people weren't allowed to go there. But anyway, he graduated from there, but he must have done some training in mathematics and science, because that was an essential part of any arts degree at that time. But I suspect that his principal studies there were in religion, because maybe he intended to become minister of the Church of Ireland. But anyway, he didn't. What he did, he got on a boat, and very soon after graduating, got on a boat. It was a convict ship, in fact, and he got a job on the convict ship as a chaplain. And off he sailed to Van Diemen's Land. Well, there was nothing very much that Tully did in his lifetime that was done on the spur of the moment, and Tully certainly would not have been heading off to Van Diemen's Land on a whim. He obviously had connections in Van Diemen's Land, and when he arrived, he was obviously met, and he appears to have led the life of a gentleman of leisure for quite some time, 8 months maybe. And then it was decided that maybe a little employment wouldn't have done him any harm, and he began training as a surveyor. Now, how much surveying he did, we really do not know. He must have done some. But later in his career in Tasmania, that is, he got mixed up with people who said they wanted to find gold. And he was involved in a search for gold in the western part of Tasmania. And maybe he was generally after gold, and maybe the people who employed him were generally after gold, but they didn't find any at that time. But some writers of the period say that there was a great push on among the genteel people of Van Diemen's Land to thwart the taking up of land in the west of the colony by these free settlers, and they were able to thwart that to some extent by pretending that they were searching for gold and making gold claims. Now, whether that's true or not in relation to Tully, I don't know, but certainly that's true that some of the researchers now of the settlement of that period claim. Whether they claim that specifically in relation to Tully or not, I do not know. But anyway, he was very much involved in the search for gold, or theoretically in the search for gold, but he didn't really find any. Now, I have heard, and I will quote no names, but I have heard people in areas of the Queensland government who do say, you know, we wondered just how much surveying Tully had actually done before he came to Queensland. But nevertheless, he did arrive in Queensland. But again, Tully was no roving surveyor for hire. You may be sure that if Tully had came to Queensland, he came with very good letters of recommendation. Now, Tully, of course, was a very smooth operator, and he married in Tasmania the daughter of Simeon Lord Jr. Now, Simeon Lord Jr. was the chief son, or not the chief son, the first son of Simeon Lord Sr. Simeon Lord Sr. was a convict who had stolen some cloth and was transported to Van Diemen's Land on the basis of having stolen the cloth. Now, it wasn't a silk hanky. In fact, when I saw the list of stuff that he'd stolen, he didn't exactly need a pantechnicon to move it, but he would probably have needed quite a commodious cart. But anyway, off he came to Sydney, and he did very well. But he was a great wheeler dealer. He knew how to use the law. He knew how to make money. He knew how to get involved with the sale of rum and all of that type of thing. And he became a very, very rich man. And he had a house in Botany in Sydney, of which I will tell more at some later stage. But the people who write about him say that his great contribution, of course, or his great achievement in life, was actually the education of his sons. And he made sure that his sons were very, very well trained. And so he ended up one of the chief men of the colony, and, he was really big time. This is the convict lord. But his children ended up in the pastoralists, bankers, really, really important jobs and well-trained jobs. And the eldest son, Simeon, was down in Tasmania at a place called Avoca, and he had a place there. And his eldest daughter, I suppose, married Tully. So Tully married into one of the most influential families in Van Diemen's Land, and certainly one of the most influential families in New South Wales. So that he married very, very well, I can tell you. But he was also something of a social butterfly, and he was one of the foundation members of the Tasmania Club, a very select club for gentlemen, and I don't think you easily got into that particular club. But anyway, he led quite a good life. But in 1862, I think it was, I saw that the lords in Avoca, which included Tully, sold up. Now, I thought they had come up to Queensland, but that's not so. Simeon Lord remained in Tasmania for a couple of years and moved down to Vaucluse in Hobart, and there he remained, and he didn't come to Queensland until the mid-1870s. But the son-in-law, Tully, was dispatched to Queensland. Well, he wasn't dispatched to Queensland on a whim, and he got to Queensland in, I can't remember the date, it was September or October of 1863. And immediately he arrived, he was made Commissioner for Crown Lands for Kennedy. Well, that was a bit of a strange appointment because Kennedy was a Crown Lands department, or a Crown Lands section, if you like, that had been divided into two parts, north and south. It required only 2 commissioners for Crown Lands, and they had already been appointed. And yet, lo and behold, Tully arrives and he's made Commissioner of Crown Lands for Kennedy, a 3rd Commissioner for Crown Lands. Well, you think, why could that be? Well, of course, there was a very highly publicised project going on up at Rockingham Bay, and they were going to start up a settlement up there, supported by the Queensland government, and they took 4 settlers or something like that. But anyway, up to Rockingham Bay they went, and they were going to set up this new settlement, the experiment in the north. Well, this was a pretty high-profile thing. All sorts of big names were involved. And lo and behold, Tully was the surveyor. Well, this was no load upon his shoulders, of course, because he, I take it, travelled up to about Bowen, I think, in a very comfortable coastal, trading ship. And then he left with the main party for Rockingham Bay with a provisions boat in tow called the Pioneer, I think it was. And so up he went. He spent about 4 months up there, and he didn't have very much to do. It seems to have been a sort of a jolly of a kind. If you go up to, it's now called Cardwell. If you go to Cardwell now, apparently Cardwell's only got 1 or 2 streets. But Tully's job, and only job, was to survey, or first of all to define a town reserve, but to survey the one street of Tully. Not Tully, of Cardwell. And he marked out the allotments of choice for the settlers. Other than that, he went fishing. He went into the sea for bath and nearly walked over a crocodile. And but other than that, though, he didn't seem to do much. He just seemed to be sort of a supernumerary. And he got back to Brisbane, I think, sometime in April, but he'd had a very pleasant sort of time. But they had other plans for him, because while he was up in the north in Kennedy, he was then appointed, they defined the Warrego Crown Lands area, separate from any sort of Maranoa area. Excuse me. And Tully was named Commissioner for Crown Lands for Warrego. And so he arrived back in Brisbane, and he must have spent a little bit of time doing I don't know what in head office. But anyway, it was decided in 1864 that a town reserve needed to be established on the Warrego, because there was a great clamouring for some evidence of government organisation there. And of course they wanted a court and a lock-up and a post office or something like that. And so they couldn't do any of those things. The first step was to proclaim or get the town reserve done. So anyway, the job obviously would go to the surveyor Tully. Okay. Well, I would wonder how much he welcomed that particular appointment, because I don't know that Tully's bum had sat on a horse for any great length of time in the past. He had travelled up to Rockingham Bay in a very comfortable boat. He certainly returned in a comfortable boat. When he was in Tasmania, he would have had very small trips, possibly in a very fancy buggy of some kind. And certainly as a denizen of the Tasmania Club, he would have been living a fairly comfortable life. And at home, amidst the luxury of the Lord establishment, again, he would have been comfortable. So here he was, given the job of riding 500 miles on horseback to the Warrego. Well, his bum would have been sore. And I once rode on a horse, an old horse we found down the 2 miles somewhere, big fat thing. And we decided we wouldn't ride home. We decided we'd ride home on the horse. Well, it fitted me, it fitted my cousin, it fitted my brother, and off we went. Well, I can tell you, that was the extent of my horse riding, and I could hardly, my legs sort of were splayed by the time I got home, and they were sore for a week. So I can well sympathise with Tully and his legs and his bum after riding 500 miles to Charleville. But off he went. He had no choice. He was the Commissioner for Crown Lands. Now, he was told, despite the fact that they tried to pretty up the story a couple of years later, he was to survey the land. This is told by Gregory, the Surveyor General. He was to survey a town site at Mangalore. But, as you well know, the town didn't go to Mangalore, the town went to Charleville. And so what had happened? Well, it would appear that somebody got to the ear of the very corrupt minister of the time called Macalister. Now, Macalister was one of the most notoriously corrupt members of the Queensland Parliament for decades. He began when I first came across him, and certainly in 1864 as the Minister for Lands and Mines or something like that. And but eventually he became Premier from time to time. And if you take the trouble to plot Tully's career and appointment dates against the dates of the various promotions and the general success of Macalister as a politician, you'll find that the dates coincide almost precisely. So Tully did seem to have a friend in the Queensland government. And Macalister was well known for riding roughshod over the instructions of the departmental heads, and he was well known for issuing contrary instructions to those that had been given by the departmental heads. And it would appear, from what I gather, that when Tully left Brisbane, Gregory had told him to go and survey Mangalore, but Macalister had told him go and survey somewhere, but not Mangalore. So off he went. Well, of course, he couldn't go anywhere near Mangalore. But of course, he had a sore bum, and he knew that when he got back to Brisbane, he had a big-time job available for him. Can you imagine? Are you surprised? A job had been declared, unfilled at the time that Pew went to print. Deputy Commissioner of Crown Lands. Well, of course, Tully knew he was the man for the job, and everyone would have known he was going to get the job. And so he wasn't too keen on sticking around Charleville. So out he went. Well, he knew that he had to leave Mangalore alone. Well, what was he going to do? Maybe he could have gone up and had a look around the Neve and the Yo-Yo, because they had been touted as possible locations for this new capital. But his recorder, or the recorder for the Warrego district, was a fellow called Carter. Carter decided to camp at the Upper Crossing because, remember, there was a fair amount of trade going on at the Upper Crossing. And anyway, Tully would have known Carter was there, and so he went to the Upper Crossing, and he wasn't going to spend much time, and so he defined the reserve between the Upper Crossing and Gowrie, and then sort of 2 miles inland to 2,560 or something acres, something like that. But he didn't look very hard. But the thing was that 1864 was the year of an amazing flood, probably one of the greatest floods ever that we know of in that area. All of the western rivers were flooded, and flooded terribly. if you go to the newspapers of that period, the records of the 1864 flood they're filled with them. It was a notorious flood and probably the greatest flood ever. And as Churton says, Tully seemed to have been quite untroubled by the fact that the debris from the flood stood 8 feet above the heads of the surveying party. Well, that didn't seem to trouble Tully. Now, Tully wanted to get back to Brisbane. He was as lazy as hell. He surveyed someplace other than Mangalore. He seemed quite innocent of the fact that, as a surveyor, it was really not a good idea to locate a town reserve in a flood-prone area. But anyway, he wasn't worried about that. And if he did receive any advice from people like Carter or any of the local people there that he may have met along the way, he obviously ignored their representations and was basing his surveying on his own rather askew judgment, and got back to Brisbane with all speed, all 500 miles of it on horseback. How he actually got there, I don't know. I've never really been able to work out quite what route he may have taken. Been so much rain, he could well have gone to what had been the headquarters of Warrego at either Surat or St George, and maybe he could have made his way across with all of the creeks in that area with a bit of water in them towards the Cunnamulla area, and then made his way up. Churton says that he arrived in Mangalore and was sent on his way, but I don't think that was so. But certainly some people at Mangalore who may not have mentioned or may not have met Tully on the site had certainly got to the ear of Macalister. And so Tully, with his incompetence and his carelessness, left Charleville in whatever it was, maybe August or September 1864. He went back, he was declared Deputy Commissioner of Crown Lands, and it was over his name, that was in December of 1864, and it was over his name on the 11th of January 1865 that the reserve was actually gazetted. So there we are. But anyway, time moves on. I'd better stop and move on with the other peculiarities in some next talk.